Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the El Cerro wash processed Peru from Amaya Coffee. And there's the container right there. And Amaya, based out of Houston, Texas. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel. As they're a coffee roaster, I had zero familiarity with going into this review. Now, the quick backstory behind this coffee is that the head roaster of Amaya, Kirk, reached out to us asking if we'd be interested in trying out some of their coffees. So I told him to reach back out to us when they had something that they wanted to highlight, and this is the coffee that they suggested to us. So we went ahead and purchased it. And it was originally going to make for an interesting review, given that not only is this coffee roasted on the probe app, but it also very much sounded like my type of coffee. Now it should make for an even more interesting review, given that the El Cerro is our coffee of the month from H&S that we are also in the process of working on. So it'll certainly be interesting to compare and contrast these two coffees alongside each other. But for now, we will start with this one, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a toned down one at a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which usually indicates a more medium fine grind. However, we went a little bit more coarse on that grind compared to that. Now, roast profile of this coffee. So when Kirk originally reached out to us, he described their coffee's profile as being on the lighter side of a light medium. And I can kind of see that. I feel like it does still skew probably a bit closer to that medium light profile, as it definitely did have a slight bit of a roasty quality relative to the majority of coffees that we do review on this channel. So I feel like it falls a little bit more in line with that as far as that more traditional American profile goes, as it's not necessarily the lightest coffee out there. They did highlight the fact that they didn't want to underdevelop their coffees, so kind of keep all of that in mind, but I feel like that's the best way to describe it. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 10, first impression through the V60, and that was the big takeaway from the first try, as it definitely didn't necessarily feel like the lightest coffee, but it definitely felt like it also needed more time for this one to open up, as it showed glimpses of potential, as there was an ever so slightly fleeting in and out sweetness with some subtle sugary and stone fruit qualities. But I definitely felt like the best of this coffee was to come, and it's rare that I actually do open a coffee on day 10, but I did open this one up, and I kind of took a look at the roast profile of this coffee, and I said, I feel like I can probably start this one a little early. I'm kind of curious to see how much it might change if we do start this coffee a little bit earlier than normal, and that's why we opted to open up on that day 10 mark. Also, in addition to that, we were going to Denver right after, and I really wanted to try this coffee before I went to Denver, so that's why we revisited it on day 16, and we opted for the Chemex, and there was a pretty similar impression the second time around. As the coffee has opened up a little bit relative to that first impression, there's a bit more prominent of a sugary stone fruit this time around, with a little bit longer lasting of a finish as well, so definitely marked improvement from that first try. Day 19 through the April brewer, and it feels like this coffee might have backtracked from the previous experience, as there's that ever so slight extra bit of development that does slightly take away from the clarity. So this one is a gesha, and for that reason I do have some very high expectations for the overall cleanliness of this coffee, but if it is going to be marred by an ever so slight roasty smoky quality, then that can hinder the overall experience somewhat, as there's a little less defined of that citric and stone fruit forward experience this time around. So mixed impressions with this brewer. But we go ahead and move on to day 22, as we opted for the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments. So of course, lower temperatures, higher concentration, and the coffee was the best it had been to this point, as it did seem to mitigate a slight bit of those more developed qualities, leading to better clarity and a more pronounced stone fruit sense to it, with a little less of that citric intensity, which is definitely a trade-off I'm more than happy to make. Now, at times this coffee could have been slightly overbearing in terms of the citric qualities, as it did seem to completely dominate a lot of the stone fruit characteristics to it. And for that reason, if I was able to mitigate that, some of those slightly roasty qualities, and amplify the peachiness to it, I was going to be very happy with this coffee, and that seems to be the case with that day 22 mark. On day 26, through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and there's a sense that this coffee really needs an extended cool down for it to open up, as you can feel a slight bit of those developed qualities when it is at some slightly warmer temperatures. But it does open up in a stone fruit and sugary fruit sense around room temperature. It did feel improved overall, so I have seen marked improvement with this coffee over time, even if I wouldn't necessarily say that it has reached some of the expectations that I did have for it as of this moment. Day 29 through the V60 with lower extraction adjustments and a slightly more coarse grind. So this really did seem to help. I just felt like it was a little bit more coarse. Well, it needed a little bit more coarse of a grind to really help this coffee. And the primary shift to it has been a toning down of the citrus once again. And I really should highlight and amplify just how much of the citric qualities there was, because it really did seem to skew so much in that direction at times that I really couldn't pull out a lot of the other characteristics to it. There are some nice florals, there are some nice stone fruit qualities, but it did seem like when you went a little bit higher on the extraction on this one, the lemon, those citric qualities did really seem to dominate it otherwise. Outside of that, we get a slightly sweeter and sugary peach quality to it. The developed qualities are also felt toned down, which definitely seemed to help this coffee in general. Day 32, through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and there were some mixed feelings, as once again that development is definitely felt, as the coffee might have dropped off ever so slightly with time. There's a little bit of that burnt popcorn taste, which I often describe as being reminiscent of honeysuckle, as it does have a lingering citric quality to it. Once again, that citrus was something that at times I couldn't seem to shake. It was an ever-present quality. If anything, I would say it was the most abundant and prominent quality within this coffee. Day 35 through the V60 with those lower extraction adjustments, and it feels like this coffee might have dropped off ever so slightly with time, but the experience is closer to the day 29 mark than it has been with any of the Chemex experiences that we've had from this coffee, with a mostly citric forward experience. So at the end of the day, it did feel like a slightly losing battle as the citric qualities won, whereas I was really trying to amplify a lot more of those stone fruit and floral qualities to it. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a handful of level 4s. Let's go ahead and start with the cleanliness level 4. Most important thing within this tasting wheel, it is a washed Peruvian gesha, so the hope going into it is that it would score a level 5 in terms of the cleanliness. But I feel like when it comes to a profile like this, it might be a little bit too hard to get all the way up there at that level 5 in terms of the cleanliness, because that slightly smoky quality, we'll just go ahead and discuss that there at level 2, is going to hinder that overall experience. For me personally, I don't think it's possible for any coffee to score a level 5 in terms of cleanliness if there is at least a little bit of that smoky quality to it. So for that reason, it did score a little lower in that sense. Other than that, I mean, it's pretty well defined. It's a gesha. You're getting plenty of those stone fruits, plenty of those florals, plenty of those citric qualities, a lot of those citric qualities. So nice cleanliness. Otherwise, level 4 is the ideal place for that. Finish, level 4. And I continuously harp on the citric quality within this one, mostly because it just seemed to really dominate a lot of the experiences that we did have for this coffee. And that was also quite present within the finish itself and pretty abundant throughout the entirety of this coffee. So finish, pretty high, level 4, not really surprising in that sense. Sweetness, level 4. Peruvian geshas tend to be extremely sweet in general, and this one was a little atypical of the majority of Peruvian geshas that we've had in the past. Now, I don't have too many in this profile with drum roasters, so the ones I think of the most are a lot of the experiences we've had with, say, in the past, which is roasted on the Loring, and then some of the ones we're working on are from H&S, which is an extremely light profile to them. And for that reason, I feel like the sugariness, the sweetness is presented in a slightly different sense, as this one has a little bit more of a traditional sugary feel to it, a little bit more of that Probat-like characteristic. And I'm going to be completely honest, I completely forgot what the roasting machine that Amaya was using when I was working on this coffee, but I kept thinking to myself, man, this does taste like those late 2010s coffees, those maybe slightly early 2020s coffees, as it definitely did have that Probat-like characteristic to it, which makes a lot of sense given that that's the way that this coffee continued to trend the majority of the time that we were working on it. Florality, level 4. I mentioned the honeysuckle-like qualities to it. I can't quite recall. I think maybe they have a generic floral note listed on here, but I could definitely see a little bit of that. I oftentimes describe it as being that, butter popcorn jelly bean. That's what it tastes like to me. And it did have that slight touch of roastiness to it, which did seem to just give it that, as I described, burnt popcorn-like feel to it. But plenty of that honeysuckle-like characteristic to it, level 4 on that. Citrus fruit, level 4, by far the most consistent, prominent, dominant characteristic within this coffee. I would definitely say that it's much more on that lemon side of things, and given that there's plenty of sweetness to it, it's not necessarily the worst thing. Not the biggest fan of citric qualities, but at least when it comes in a sweeter sense, it's much more enjoyable for me. A couple of level 3s, we will start with the acidity level 3. Pretty fair, I would say that I think given the profile of this coffee and what it is, it's not surprising that it scored right there at that mark, a little bit more medium in that sense. But given that there's a lot of citric brightness to this one, it could have actually scored a little higher, but level 3 is where we decided to put it. Stone fruit level 3. I would say there were times where it was the most abundant quality, though that was fleeting for the majority of the time. And when it was the most abundant quality, it was the most enjoyable experience that I did have for this coffee in general. But level 3 is where we settled on it by the end, mostly because it didn't seem to be quite as prominent or consistent as that citric quality. Caramel level 3. And I do have to say that that's that Probat characteristic. And I really always like that about Probat coffees, is that they seem to have that kind of caramelized sweetness to them. And I've heard so many people in the past say that if you really like Probat coffees, you really like Probat coffees. And I really like Probat coffees. Some of my favorite coffees ever have been roasted on Probats. So level 3 is where we opted to put it. It always just seems to have that very fun, unique characteristic to it that a lot of other roasting machines don't have. So level 3. And then final thing worth discussing, body level 2. I think that could have gone anyway, given that it is a Peruvian gesha. So gesha, of course, would insinuate slightly lower body. Peru would insinuate slightly higher body. And the profile of this coffee being a slight bit more developed could have insinuated more medium body, but it did just have a lighter body texture to it. So level 2 is where we opted to put it. Outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It was honestly mixed because I went into it with some extremely high expectations. You paint the picture of working on a Probat coffee that should be slightly lighter, then I'm going to have some very high expectations for it going into it. And I would say, yeah, there just was that slight roasty quality, which did give it a little bit more development than is usually in line with my own preferences. And given that this coffee in theory was one that I'm very much supposed to enjoy, it sounds very much like my type of coffee, every part of it. It's washed, it's Probat, it's got peach qualities to it, it's got floral qualities to it. I think all of those things kind of combined didn't necessarily lend itself towards the best impression, given that it was just a little bit further along than I necessarily would have liked. But even then, I did pull out a lot of positives from it. It did have some very nice peachy qualities to it. It did have some very nice floral qualities to it, and it did very much taste like a Probat coffee. So definitely some really positive qualities in that regard, which does kind of lead to the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like it does still lean a little bit more into the more traditional coffee drinker, as it's not quite to the same extent as the modern coffees that we are working on the majority of the time. Now, it's going to be very interesting when we do get to our H&S review of this coffee, because I've had a couple of experiences with that coffee as of this moment, and you couldn't even tell that these are both Peruvian geshas. They are just so unbelievably different in the way that they present themselves that I wouldn't consider for one second that they are the same coffee whatsoever. So that should make for a pretty interesting comparison. But again, that's a much more modern approach, I would say, as I feel like that's a little bit more niche in terms of the lightness of that coffee. But this one right here did have some really nice characteristics in terms of the sweetness, that kind of Probat-like caramelized component to it, those florals, as well as some really nice fruit depth, and it didn't offer too much of that brightness. So a lot more of what a traditional coffee drinker would enjoy. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from this coffee roaster, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the El Cerro wash processed Peru from Amaya Coffee. Thank you for watching.